It takes you back, doesn't it? Certainly takes me back. When I went to school, schools seemed to be fairly sensible. I often got into trouble and I was called a bad boy. And when I did things that were good, I was told I was good. That used to be the way it goes. But if you go to Loughborough Amherst School in Leicestershire, they banned the words good and bad. Because to describe pupils' behaviour in that way will make them feel guilty. The headmaster says, while I don't want teachers to be soft, I also don't want them to be shouty and to make the pupils feel guilty. And he's used replacing the words good and bad with skillful and unskillful, which students of the language will realise have no equivalence whatsoever with the words good and bad. But he says it takes it from Buddhism and that this is less loaded and a more accurate way of describing things. No, it's not. It's totally inaccurate. You are censoring language, you idiot. Let's talk to the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young. Good evening, Toby.
Good evening, Kevin.
Dare I say good evening or bad evening? I mean, what on earth is this teacher on about?
It is extraordinary. Every time you think we've reached peak woke, Kevin, the floor gives way and we just start falling through the building again. The Free Speech Union wrote to Aston University in Birmingham this weekend because one of the departments at Aston University, the School of Social Sciences and Humanities, issued incoming freshers with a guide that included a long list of prescribed words, that is, words the students were being advised not to use. They included layman, the deaf, founding fathers, ethnic, mentally ill, which should be replaced with mental health service user. Mixed race was on the verboten list. Extraordinarily, it said you have to be careful about describing yourself as British because, quote, the idea of British can imply a false sense of unity. It was absolutely extraordinary, Kevin. To think that these poor incoming students at Aston University, one of the first things they learn about their new environment isn't that it's a place for open and free intellectual discussion and debate, but that it's a place where if they use the wrong word completely innocently, if they refer to someone who describes themselves as mixed race, they could get into trouble. You see, it's extraordinary.
This just stuff always it makes you and I laugh. We've often dissolved into hysterics about all of this, which tends to overshadow what I think is the serious nature of this problem. So Julian Murphy, he's the headmaster at Loughborough Amherst School. He says that replacing the words good and bad with skillful and unskillful is a less loaded, I don't know what he means by that, and a more accurate way of describing things. Well, it's not. There is no equivalence between the word good and skillful and the word bad and unskillful. They're different kinds of words. So what annoys me about this is the linguistic inaccuracy that he is lumbering his pupils with, and the fact that, you're from the Free Speech Union. This is a kind of Orwellian censorship of our language, isn't it?
It is, yes. It's where thought control begins, Kevin, and that's what's at the root of this. It's politically activist groups, ideologues, trying to control the way people think by dictating the language they can use. We've seen it, it's a facet. It was a facet of the Soviet Union. It was a facet of Mao's China. It was identified in Orwell's 1984 as one of the telltale signs of a totalitarian society. And I think the attempt to control every aspect of speech, I'm not just talking about banning certain clearly hateful words. I'm talking about trying to ban words like good and bad, suggest that our society is heading in a totalitarian direction, and we have to resist it with everything we've got.
There are 313 pupils at this school from the age of 4 to 18. And the headmaster goes on to say, I'm not interested in making young people feel bad. He uses that forbidden word. I'm just interested in them learning and us helping them mature and become more skillful people. I mean, my question really, Toby, is, I mean, I'm sure, what's his name? Julian Murphy's a lovely man, but I just think if this is the way he thinks, he is profoundly in the wrong kind of job.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the right attitude for an educator. And you get the impression that he hasn't spent a lot of time in the classroom, or he'd know that actually most children these days have a great deal of difficulty spelling the word skillful and unskillful. So to insist they replace
There's
good and
that
bad
as
with
well.
those words is just asking for trouble. It's the people who make these proposals often do so in the belief that they'll be improving the general tone of society. This sort of tone policing is intended to make people feel safer, to protect their mental well-being, not stigmatize them in any way. And that's how it starts. It starts with good intentions, but we can see where they lead. If we look at what happened at the University of Sussex last week to
Yes, with the
Kathleen Stock,
yeah.
the professor of philosophy, students, in the name of protecting vulnerable trans students in their community, are essentially threatening Kathleen Stock, this 49-year-old professor of philosophy, who happens not to think that trans women should be able to compete against trans men in single-sex sports, doesn't think that trans women should get access to women's prisons or women's changing rooms. I mean, perfectly reasonable, arguable positions that I think the majority of the British public would share. But in the name of protecting trans students, these student activists, apparently with the best of intentions, are threatening Kathleen Stock with violence, if you look at some of the statements they've issued, unless Sussex University fires her. So it's a very short journey to go from this apparently kind of nice, well-intentioned starting point to becoming a sort of really unpleasant censor threatening anyone who disagrees with you with violence in the name of protecting the vulnerable.
So yeah, so we have that going on at universities, and of course Sussex is only one of the many universities who commit crimes against free speech every day in every way. And we have this going on at this school, this kind of nonsense, and then of course corporations kind of take it up. What did you think yesterday of British Airways' decision to cancel the words "ladies" and "gentlemen"? Corporate virtue signalling at its most absurd, I would suggest.
Well, one of the really odd things that's happened in the past 10, maybe just the past 5 years or so, is the spread of woke ideology into the private sector. You know, not so long ago, the private sector served as a kind of bulwark against the creeping socialism of the public sector, the BBC, most aspects of the mainstream media. But that's changed. That Chinese wall has been breached. And now the private sector is increasingly as woke as the public sector. And it makes it very difficult, I think, for people in the private sector. There are these vast HR bureaucracies searching through their private social media accounts. Often in the Free Speech Union, Kevin, we find ourselves coming to the aid of people who have been put through a disciplinary process at work as a result of something they've said in a private social media conversation. In one case, it was someone who was having a private conversation on WhatsApp. It wasn't even a WhatsApp group. It was just a conversation between him and his boyfriend. He then broke up with his boyfriend, and his boyfriend dobbed him into the authorities for using the word pikeys to describe gypsies and Roma people. And he ended up losing his job. And that was a
Which
man.
isn't a nice term, but it shouldn't get you in a world of trouble, really.
Well, if you use it in the conversation was his boyfriend said, "Do you mind if I stay at your house this weekend? I've got the builders in." And he replied, "No, it'll keep the pikeys out." I mean, yeah, admittedly, not a particularly nice thing to say. And no doubt there are some people who find that deeply offensive. But if it's in a private one-on-one conversation, it does seem a bit much for you to have to lose your job over that. If he'd said it in public, if he'd said it, at work in his capacity as an employee, maybe, but in a one-on-one private conversation out of office hours, that seems a bit harsh.
Yeah, isn't that the system in Scotland now, where people can be reported for private conversations at the family dinner table? So yes, it's getting worse. Last question, really, Toby. What are we to do about this? What worries me about the British Airways situation is it's typical of this kind of corporate cowardice that produces these preemptive woke strikes. So my contention would be, I'm pretty certain I'm right on this, that in the long and glorious history of British Airways, not a single passenger or customer has ever complained about the use of the phrase ladies and gentlemen, and yet preemptively British Airways bans it. I don't know where that comes from, but what can we do to stop this nonsense proliferating?
Well, I think one of the joys of the capitalist system is if you don't particularly like something that a service provider is doing, you can always use another service provider. So my advice here would be use SleazyJet instead. We saw that with Gillette. Gillette, in order to advertise razors a couple of years ago, produced a series of ads presenting traditional masculine men as being toxic. And not surprisingly, sales of their razors, went down the toilet. So hopefully, the get woke, go broke will apply in the case of British Airways.
Well, I hesitate to say this, Toby, but it has been good speaking to you.